Are you wondering what is the difference between a normal boss fight and a mythic boss fight? Well, it's simple, really. In a normal boss fight, your party will encounter their arch-nemesis on top of an ancient volcano. Whereas, in a mythic boss fight, your party will encounter their arch-nemesis on top of an ancient volcano as it's erupting during the middle of a lightning storm. Today, we're going to talk about how to storytell Pathfinder 2nd Edition using the new Mythic Rules from War of Immortals on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller that is just a little bit disappointed Paizo didn't give me a mythic monologuing option for my monsters in the book War of Immortals. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome to my coverage of the Mythic Rules in Pathfinder 2e and, strangely, my revival of my old Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e series. A while back on this channel, I had a series that was dedicated specifically to the art of storytelling in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. That series got thrown off by the Remastered project, and then my subsequent return to school in real life kind of prevented me from properly reviving that series. But essentially, I as a storyteller really love Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and I find that the rule set of this game gives me a lot of fantastic tools for telling some absolutely amazing stories. However, I have seen that a lot of people who've come to Pathfinder from other games have struggled with how to use the Pathfinder 2e rule set in order to tell good stories, and so the Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e series was imagined as a way of helping both new and experienced storytellers access the rules in Pathfinder 2e in order to tell epic tales at their gaming table. Well, speaking of epic tales, recently in the book War of Immortals, Paizo has brought Mythic Rules into Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, I played a ton of Mythic Pathfinder 1st Edition, and those rules were, how do I say this kindly as a storyteller, not even remotely balanced. Don't get me wrong, I loved the Mythic Rules, I ran several Mythic games, I had a ton of fun with Mythic Rules in Pathfinder 1st Edition, but many people who have commented on Mythic Rules in Pathfinder 1st Edition have noted that they were really difficult to use and use well, and they were very trying for storytellers who tried to integrate them into their Pathfinder 1st Edition games. Well, now Pathfinder 2nd Edition has access to Mythic Rules as well, and the Pathfinder 2e community is reacting to what all of these options mean for our gaming tables. I plan to cover the Mythic Rules from War of Immortals from a variety of different perspectives, but I actually thought it was worth starting my discussion of the Mythic Rules by looking at the Mythic Rules through the lens of storytellers. Now, part of this is there are already a ton of channels that are covering the Mythic Rules from the perspective of players. I've seen some really good videos from No Nat Ones and King Uga Tantan, and as of the recording of this video, I'm still working my way through a few of the videos from Ronald the Rules Lawyer, and I'm sure by the time this video goes live, I will have seen several other videos from several other channels, and a lot of the channels and a lot of the content surrounding Mythic Rules is looking at it from the lens of the player, which makes a lot of sense. War of Immortals is a very player-facing book, and the mythic options presented in War of Immortals by and large consider what player characters can access as a result of all of these new Mythic options running around. That being said, as much fun as players are probably going to have with the new Mythic rules, it's probably the storytellers who have the most that they need to adapt to when it comes to incorporating Mythic into a game. So in this video, my goal is simple. I want to highlight these sections of the book War of Immortals that talk about Mythic rules from the perspective of a storyteller. And if you're a storyteller for Pathfinder 2e who is interested in using Mythic rules and allowing your players to play with all of these fun new options, then I'm going to talk about the things that you will need to know, the important pieces of advice that Paizo offers, and just the general structure you want to be aware of so that you can use Mythic effectively at your gaming table. Now, obviously this video is coming out less than a month after the release of War of Immortals, which means I have not actually run a Mythic game at my table yet. And I'm sure if I were to revisit this topic in the future, I will have some more advice that I could add in on this subject. But for now, I'd like to focus in on the things that Paizo gives us to help us incorporate these rules. By the way, because this video is very much intended for storytellers, if you are strictly a player in Pathfinder 2e, I would encourage you not to go past the intro of this video. Rather, what I would encourage you to do, send your storyteller this way so they can check this video out and get a primer on how to use the Mythic rules in Pathfinder 2e, because I imagine that your storyteller is stressing out over exactly how they want to use this content, and I'm hoping that this video will be helpful to them. Still, all of that being said, I invite you all to be part of this conversation. Be sure to jump down to the comment section, let me know what questions and comments you have about storytelling in 2e with Mythic rules. If you've had a chance to run a few Mythic games, definitely leave some of your initial thoughts and impressions down in the comment section. There is a lot of new stuff here, so I'm sure that we all have something to learn on this topic. Of course, remember to do all of the other stuff that helps to support this channel. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon. All of those links will be in the video description below. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. Okay, so you're a storyteller who has heard about these new Mythic rules that Pathfinder 2e has offered, and you're interested in what they offer the gaming table, but you're also understandably nervous about adding them into the game. If that describes you, I want you to know, don't feel bad about that. Mythic has a pretty extreme reputation in the Pathfinder community, and the very fact that Paizo chose to bring Mythic forward into Pathfinder 2nd Edition, that in and of itself has some pretty serious implications for the game, and it is understandable and reasonable as a storyteller that when your players start getting giddy and going, oh, I could take this or do that, and ooh, this looks so fun, it is completely understandable that you as a storyteller might be sitting behind the Game Master screen and thinking to yourself, oh my lord, how am I ever going to manage all of this? Now, I noted in my review of War of Immortals, if you haven't seen that, you can check it out up here, that I really like War of Immortals. The Mythic rules represent the kinds of stories that I enjoy telling anyways, so I fully expect for my table to make a ton of use of the Mythic rules in Pathfinder 2e. It just kind of speaks to what me and my group really enjoy doing. However, as much as I enjoy War of Immortals, I will admit that there is I don't know if it's best described as a flaw or just a consequence of the way the book is written that is definitely worth mentioning, and that is, because War of Immortals is a very player-facing book, it can be very difficult for a game master who is approaching War of Immortals to really figure out what they need to focus on, to really figure out what sections they need to read if they want to make best use of War of Immortals. So what I want to do for this video is I want to highlight 4 sections of the book that I think are especially important for a storyteller or game master to read in War of Immortals if they would like to make use of Mythic rules. These sections are the What is Mythic section found from pages 72 to 75 of War of Immortals, the Designing Mythic Encounters section, which can be found from pages 84 to 85, the Mythic Gazetteer section, which can be found from pages 86 to page 101, and then finally, the Mythic Monsters section, both building Mythic Monsters, which can be found on pages 168 and 169, and the sample Mythic Monsters that can be found from page 170 all the way through page 215. Now, I realize that that is a lot of reading, but don't worry, some of the sections like the Mythic Gazetteer and the Mythic Monsters, especially the sample Mythic Monsters section, those are areas that you can move through at a slower pace. But each of those sections, I think, represent kind of the key concepts that you need to be aware of if you want to effectively run a Mythic game. Now, the other thing worth noting about running a Mythic game is the Mythic Rules do not stand by themselves. They are essentially an add-on set of rules that go on top of the existing Pathfinder 2nd Edition rules, and if you want to effectively run a Mythic Pathfinder 2e game, then first you need to have the basic skill set of running a normal Pathfinder 2e game. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about in this video, like designing Mythic Monsters, builds directly on top of the normal monster design rules. So, all of the information in the GM core, you still need to know and understand how that works in order to effectively adjust that information for a Mythic game. Another point that should be relatively straightforward is this: while we're focusing in this video on the Game Master side of the screen, you will, as a storyteller, want to be familiar with the player-facing information from War of Immortals. So even though we're not going to talk a lot about Mythic Callings and Mythic Destinies, how Mythic points work, things like that, even though we're not really talking about that specific information in this video, that is information that you're going to want to be familiar with. Now, I've already mentioned that there are several channels that have done some great overviews of that particular content. King Ugatantan did a 7-minute video that just overviews how the Mythic Rules work for player characters. And if you're trying to get a good big picture view of what Mythic Rules look like, especially from the player side of the screen, I would strongly recommend checking that out. And there are several other videos that go a little more in depth on these subjects. You can check those out as well. As a storyteller, you do want to be at least familiar with the things that the players are going to be interacting with. So, with that out of the way, let's start with the first section that I think storytellers really need to read from War of Immortals, which is the What is Mythic section, and specifically I would encourage you to focus on the information that is found in pages 72 through 75 of War of Immortals, where it spends a lot of time talking about the narrative that Mythic is intended to support. This is something that I think is critical to understand if you want to effectively use Mythic Rules, and that is, before you ever touch the mechanics, you need to think of Mythic as a narrative tool. You kind of hear it in the terminology that the mechanics of Mythic uses. You have phrases like Mythic Callings and Mythic Destinies, and those words alone should give you an idea of the scale or intended scope of Mythic stories. If you want to use Mythic Rules, you really need to ask yourself if they are appropriate to the narrative of your game. Certain styles of stories, especially particularly epic or over-the-top stories, lend themselves really well to Mythic Rules, while other types of stories, like survival-focused stories or gritty stories, those wouldn't actually use Mythic Rules very effectively. So as a storyteller, you always want to keep the core narrative of Mythic Rules in your mind, so that when you incorporate the mechanics, you're incorporating them effectively. Now, this section of the book is going to spend some time discussing things like the calling, trials, ordeals, approaches, the final approach, and even the implications of immortality. And all of these things are narrative elements that you are going to want to keep in mind as a storyteller. Again, thinking narratively is critical to effectively using Mythic Rules, but there are a few specific hooks that are included in this section that you as a storyteller can use to begin to think about where you can place things mechanically inside of your story. So let's go ahead and talk about those items. First up, one of the things that they emphasize to storytellers is to think about mechanically when and how your characters are going to receive mythic power. Now, yes, that does include the idea of the calling, the event where characters first get their mythic power, but it goes beyond the calling to the actual when inside of the game can your characters get mythic points. And essentially, it only happens one of three ways. First, they get a full complement of mythic points at the start of every game session. Then, they can earn additional mythic points either by completing mythic deeds or defeating mythic foes. So, at the start of every story, your players are going to refill their pool of mythic points, and then, only when they do very specific actions, or only when they defeat very specific enemies, do they refill any mythic points that they might have lost. So let's step back for a second and think about what that means for us as a storyteller when we're trying to incorporate mythic rules into a game. First, at the start of every session, your characters refill all of their mythic points. Now, there's nothing that says this has to be a special moment, but as a storyteller, you may want to stop and consider, why are my players getting their mythic points back now? Yes, from the perspective of starting a game session, it's a pretty important point in time, but why inside the story would they be recovering mythic power at that point? Now, this is something you could brush over as a storyteller, but it might be worth considering that maybe there are certain events inside the game or certain things that your player characters can do in accordance with their mythic calling that allows them to refill that pool of mythic points. It doesn't necessarily have to be something huge, but if your characters receive their mythic power from some particular entity, maybe at the start of a game session, your characters receive a message from that entity, and in receiving the message, they refill their pool of mythic points. Or maybe all of your player characters have some kind of dream that corresponds to their mythic calling, and when they wake up from that dream, they feel re-energized and recharged, and have full access to their mythic points again. This isn't something you necessarily have to do, but given the fact that this is a specific point in time where that mythic power is returning, it is worth considering what you can do as a storyteller to tie that mechanic into the narrative of the game. And they don't explicitly say this, but one thing I would say as a storyteller is it may be okay if, depending on the circumstances at your table, if you hold off on that mythic point recharge. Now, I do think it's a pretty good rule of thumb. If you're letting your players run mythic characters, they should probably have access to all of those mythic points every single game session. So as a storyteller, I would only very rarely withhold that recharge, but it may be worthwhile if your players are starting in a certain point that doesn't fit that narratively, maybe that you wait 30 minutes, 45 minutes into the game for something that's a little more appropriate to regaining mythic power, and then let your characters recharge at that point. Past that automatic refill though, there are 2 points that will only exist inside of the game if you as a storyteller put them inside the game. And that is when your players complete mythic deeds or when they defeat mythic foes. Now, both of these phrases definitely have some flexibility in their interpretation. As for the phrase completing mythic deeds, every calling is going to have at least one example of what it means to complete a mythic deed so that that character can regain a mythic point. So if you have the acrobat's calling and you critically succeed at an acrobatics check, you get a point of mythic power back. That is an example of completing a mythic deed. Every one of your player characters will have a calling that has some kind of effect like that stapled to it, so those certainly count. But thinking a little more broadly, as a storyteller, you want to include moments inside the story where your players can attempt and potentially succeed at some larger-than-life accomplishments that will, in and of themselves, be worth regaining a mythic point. One thing that's worth noting on the subject of completing mythic deeds, this is one of those areas where there need to be opportunities for individual mythic deeds and group mythic deeds that can potentially restore mythic power. The individual deeds, good examples of that are things like what you see in the mythic callings, but it might also be worth considering moments where the group working together can overcome a major obstacle or accomplish something really important to the story, and then as a group, everyone regains a point of mythic power reflecting those accomplishments. So what you want to do is ask yourself as a storyteller, what moments can I put into my story that will give my players individually and collectively opportunities to perform mythic deeds? And then the other item that's mentioned is the idea of defeating mythic foes. Now, the easiest definition of defeating mythic foes is rolling initiative, taking them down, getting some mythic power back. But in keeping with the idea that mythic is a narrative tool, that word defeating should be something that has some room to play with. This book talks about things like mythic tricksters, so the idea of one of your players, or possibly the whole group taken together, pulling some kind of legendary con on a villain and then getting away without consequence, that could also be an example of defeating a mythic opponent and earning some mythic power as a result. As a storyteller, your players will start the game with some mythic power, and then will gain mythic power either by accomplishing mythic deeds or defeating mythic opponents. And as a result, you want to think about, how do I put narrative moments inside the game that correspond to those ideas? Those are some of the major narrative touchstones worth thinking about when you design a mythic game, but this section of War of Immortals also points out a few other things that you should think about, and one of the big things that they emphasize that's going to run a little contrary to the points I've made so far is the idea of player agency. So one of the big ideas in mythic storytelling is that mythic characters are the kinds of characters that reshape the world around them. Their calling and destiny is so large and grand that the world is changed by their presence in what should be dramatic ways, and to that effect, as a storyteller, you want to think about ways to give your characters some serious player agency in the story. This may not be something that you can do every single game session, but it is something you should think about throughout the course of your story. What are some major beats you can put into your story where your players have a significant choice, and the outcome of that choice is going to change the game world in a very noticeable and significant way? Player choice is always a good thing in TTRPGs, but in mythic stories especially, player agency is a critical aspect of the story, so as a storyteller you want to plan for those things. Another point that they highlight in this section is the idea that mythic stories, or at least mythic elements within a story, always have a specific purpose. Remember, the idea of mythic is captured by terms like calling and destiny. These are not random things. These are major moments for characters, meaning if you're going to drop a mythic element into a game, you really need to consider what is the purpose of that particular mythic element in the story. This isn't just a magical sword, this is a mythic sword. What is the story of the sword, and why is that sword important? And so important that your characters acquiring it would count as a mythic deed. This isn't just a dangerous villain that your players have to beat. This is a dangerous villain that your characters are invested in beating for a specific reason. Why is there a rivalry there? What is it that makes this particular person someone that your players must confront and must defeat in order to advance their own story? As a storyteller in Pathfinder 2e, there are plenty of occasions where adding random story elements, random encounters, random adventure opportunities are completely appropriate to your game, and you still want to use those random elements in storytelling, but when you're using mythic elements, it is a pretty good rule of thumb to say mythic elements should always be there for a specific reason. There's another thing that's highlighted in this section that I think needs a little bit of setup to properly understand. You see, one piece of advice that they give storytellers in this section is to make use of the idea of sacrifice. Now, before we talk about how to use sacrifice, let's talk about why to use sacrifice. Mythic stories are, in a word, dramatic. Mythic stories are over the top, they're larger than life, they reshape the world around them in dramatic ways. Mythic stories are intended to be dramatic stories, and one of the easiest ways to add some drama to a story is to add some sacrifice to the story. Now, there are a lot of different ways that you can use sacrifice. There could just be the potential for sacrifice, the idea that attempting something is extremely dangerous and a person is putting their life on the line. That is a fairly common use of the trope, but maybe you have a situation where in order for a character to succeed, they can't just defeat the villain, they then also have to sacrifice something on top of that defeat in order to ensure a permanent victory. Whether that sacrifice might be something like an item that is important to them, or possibly sacrificing their life in order to achieve a victory. Sacrifice can fall at several points along the drama scale, but sacrifice is an easy way to add drama to a story, so it is a tool worth considering if you want to run Mythic games. Also, on the subject of sacrifice, if you want to play around with Mythic rules a little bit in your game, but you don't want to just completely rewrite your whole game so that you're just always using Mythic going forward, one of the options that is presented here is that characters might receive Mythic power for a limited period of time, and once they have defeated the final villain or overcome the final obstacle associated with that goal, they then have to sacrifice their Mythic power in order to achieve final victory. So, quick note for storytellers who might want to play around with Mythic power but don't want it to hang around for an entire campaign. The theme of sacrifice fits very well with Mythic stories and can allow you as a storyteller to put a clear timeline to that Mythic power so that your game can then go back to normal when it's done. So those are some different examples of ways that you can try to hook Mythic mechanics into your story at specific points or in specific ways. But there is one final piece of advice in this section that I want to highlight because I do think it's pretty important, and that is the idea that Mythic stories should not always be mythic. Now, I know this may sound a little strange, but it's kind of one of those too much of a good thing situations, in that if everything in your story is mythic, the actual emotional weight of the mythic story begins to be, well, lost because there's just too much going on. In order for your players to really appreciate mythic moments and mythic powers in the story, it's worth remembering that not everything needs to be mythic. You still want your characters to have normal moments, normal story beats, normal encounters that they have to deal with, as those normal encounters will do a couple of things. First, the normal encounters will make your mythic encounters stand out or pop a little bit more inside your game, and second, and let's go ahead and be honest, this is really the main reason this piece of advice is here, the normal encounters give your player characters an opportunity to be ridiculously overpowered in scenarios where they normally wouldn't be. And that is fun, and you want your players to have that experience. Paizo actually recommends what I call a 1 in 3 mythic rule, which is the idea that when you're planning out encounters as a storyteller, you want to make sure that about 1 out of every 3 encounters that you plan for your players has a mythic element of some kind, but you want 2 out of 3 encounters to be relatively normal encounters. This will allow the mythic encounters to push your players and let them experience the full extent of their powers, while also giving them the joy of running around as larger-than-life characters in what is an otherwise normal world. So those are some of the main ideas from the What is Mythic section. Now that we've talked about all that, let's dig a little deeper into designing mythic encounters. This section divides designing mythic encounters into roughly 3 different tiers. And here's where we need to pause and realize something very important about designing mythic encounters. The player-facing side of the Mythic Rules is split into roughly 2 sections, Mythic Callings and Mythic Destinies. I guarantee you most of the commentary you've seen on Mythic Rules in Pathfinder 2e talks about these 2 different tiers of play, the Mythic Calling tier at low levels and the Mythic Destiny tier at high levels, But the Mythic Calling tier is actually subdivided into two different sections when you look at it as a storyteller. The actual advice for storytellers is a little more granular than what the player side of this book is going to show you. So for players who are looking at Mythic Rules, they're going to be looking at Mythic Calling rules, which go from level 1 to level 10, and then they're going to be looking at Mythic Destiny rules, which go from level 12 to level 20. For storytellers, that level 12 to level 20 section is viewed very much as the same chunk, but that first section, the Mythic Calling section, can be further divided into first level to 6th level play, and then 6th level to 10th level play, and at every one of those three stages as a storyteller, you need to be thinking about how you design your game just a little bit differently. Now again, in terms of Mythic, I've emphasized this over and over again, the most important term is the concept of narrative. So let's ask ourselves, what is the intended narrative of these three different chunks of play, and how can you use Mythic Rules in these three different tiers of play to enhance your stories? Now, Paizo does not use these terms. These are my terms, but I think you'll understand why I use these terms for each of these sections. For 1st through 6th level Mythic characters, I like to consider the Mythic Rules as being Mythic moments for your PCs. Then, from level 6 to about level 10, you move into what I term Mythic Confrontations, and then finally, on this one I'm stealing from Paizo's terminology just a little bit, from level 12 to level 20, this is where you have the Mythic Destinies. If you think about it in terms of an expanding level of power, when it comes to low-level play, Mythic characters are very similar to normal characters. They've got a little bit of extra power that allows them to have small moments here and there where that power shines through and you get just a little bit of a hint that there is something special to these characters. From 1st level to 6th level, I think Mythic Rules are intended to create characters that are, for the most part, normal, but offering small moments for every character that help them stand out. Then, when you move into the middle tiers of the game, from about level 6 to about level 10, this is where your characters are going to begin to confront serious threats head-on, and their power is going to become a little bit more reliable at the same time. Then, of course, once you get to the highest levels of play, the Mythic Destinies that Paizo gives us, this is the point where the characters are stepping into the full extent of their power, and they're going to have a lot more resources and opportunities to really show off what they are capable of. In other words, when you are running Mythic characters, don't expect low-level Mythic characters to punch with the same weight as high-level Mythic characters. That's not how the rules are designed, and that's not what the narrative intent of these three different tiers of play are. Speaking of that first tier of play, the 1st through 5th level Mythic characters, and yes, I do realize I've been saying 1st through 6th for about the last 5 minutes. Sorry about that, at least the right notes will be on screen. In that first tier of Mythic play from 1st level to 5th level, pretty much all of the Mythic abilities are going to revolve around a narrow slice of Pathfinder 2e gameplay. Essentially, all low-level Mythic options are going to influence a character's skills, saving throws, or perception. And when you take the Mythic dying rules into consideration as well, what this means at low levels is, compared to a normal character, Mythic characters have a much higher degree of survivability. They may not necessarily hit any harder than a normal character, but they're going to have a noticeable advantage when it comes to surviving challenging circumstances because of their access to Mythic power. Paizo actually notes that 1st to 5th level Mythic rules are designed primarily to enhance exploration play and downtime play in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The encounter mode of play, as discussed in the Game Master Core, is not really heavily influenced by low-level Mythic rules. Paizo goes a little bit further and describes low-tier Mythic play as a set of skeleton keys that allow you to unlock extra options for your players that they might not normally be able to access, And that makes sense when you think about Mythic Proficiency and how it works. A character with Mythic Proficiency is allowed to attempt skill checks that might normally be locked behind Expert Proficiency, Master Proficiency, Legendary Proficiency, things like that. The low-level Mythic Rules are going to allow your characters, within a narrow band of abilities that they have, to access skills and skill checks that would normally be beyond the scope of that level of play. So your low-level Mythic characters may not necessarily be able to fight any more effectively against monsters, but they might be able to negotiate more effectively, or they might be able to break into the monster's lair and steal a noteworthy item, or they might be able to trick the monster in some way, buying time for them to gain more power and come back for the full confrontation later. Paizo actually encourages, for 1st through 5th level play, to think about ways that you can incorporate additional skill checks into a Mythic game. Find ways to include more hard and very hard skill checks for your players, because given their access to Mythic skill proficiency, there's a real chance that they can hit those hard and very hard skill checks, and in so doing, you can allow your players to solve problems in very creative ways that would normally be beyond the scope of low-level play. Moving up to mid-tier Mythic play, levels 6 through 10, this is when your Mythic player characters will slowly begin to unlock abilities that use Mythic proficiency during combat. NoNat1, in one of his videos on this subject, talked about that most of your Mythic attack rolls show up at level 10. There are a few things earlier that you can use in combat, but this window of 6 through 10, this is when your Mythic characters are going to be bringing a little extra force to combat encounters, and this is where you can, as a storyteller, begin to think a little bit more about how to make Mythic confrontations, showdowns between your player characters and Mythic foes, a little more commonplace. Now, one thing that's worth noting about low-tier Mythic play and mid-tier Mythic play is Paizo recommends avoiding trivial encounters when you are designing Mythic encounters. Simply put, the trivial encounter building rules do not correspond to the kind of narrative weight that you expect in a Mythic encounter, so even during low-tier play, you want to avoid trivial encounters for the most part, and by the time you get to mid-tier play, you probably should not be using trivial encounters at all, and low difficulty encounters should probably become a little more rare as well. As your Mythic characters get more powerful, you're going to be setting aside the trivial and low threat encounters pretty commonly. However, now that we are in mid-tier Mythic encounters, levels 6 through 10, because we're now looking more seriously at what is commonly termed encounter mode play in Pathfinder 2e, because we're getting into situations where your characters are more likely to directly confront Mythic threats, one thing you want to bear in mind is, especially when you're doing boss fights, when your characters are going up against the major Mythic foes of their campaign, there is an important thing that you want to remember as a storyteller. Paizo points this out. Don't forget to let your players recharge. Essentially what Paizo is saying here is, when you start getting into the section of the game where your players are going to be facing off against major villains, it would really be anticlimactic for your players to go into that encounter with no Mythic power left and not be able to use any of their Mythic abilities. Not only would they be handicapped for the fight, but also it just wouldn't feel good to have those powers available when that fight comes to fruition. So, to this effect, Paizo frequently discusses the idea of lieutenant monsters, which are villains or monsters that have a little bit of Mythic power that you can put as a foe immediately before the major villain. And Paizo really encourages using monsters like that as an opportunity for your players to, going back to the previous section, defeat Mythic opponents in order to recharge their Mythic power, so that when they go into those big fights, they are coming in fully equipped with Mythic power and ready to make that fight as awesome as it should really be. Then of course you step into high tier Mythic play from levels 12 through 20, and at this point because your characters are fully stepping into their mythic destiny, things like trivial and low-threat encounters, at this point, they're probably not even worth doing unless your players just really want to have a session of going a little crazy with their abilities. Most trivial and low-threat encounters at this point in play, you can role-play out what happens. The players are stopped by a group of angry thugs. Role-play out how you deal with this. Player characters that are moving into their mythic destiny are the kind of characters that can deal with multiple moderate, possibly even severe threat encounters back to back and keep on swinging because of the scope of powers that they have access to. So as a storyteller, if you're doing high tier mythic play, be prepared to have more regular, tough fights and to put those fights a little bit closer together in the story, because these are the kinds of things that high tier mythic characters are intended to deal with. At this point, they have command of their power, and this is the way you want to structure the story so that you can really show that power off. Now, all of that being said, because your characters are still their typical level inside of Pathfinder 2e, that does mean that the level-based mechanics of this game haven't adjusted as much as you might initially think. To that effect, Paizo really recommends don't use extreme threat solo bosses very often unless your players are very familiar with their powers, very good at using teamwork, and have a full complement of mythic equipment and spells that they can use in that fight. Just like you can hamstring a normal Pathfinder 2e party if you're not giving them the expected amount of equipment and magical gear, you can hamstring a mythic party by forgetting to give them the mythic equipment and spells that they need to really engage those high-end opponents. So as a storyteller, don't lose track of that, and remember to include those things, especially if you're going to be using those extreme threat bosses. Now, stepping back and looking at designing mythic encounters as a whole, there are a couple of pointers that are worth mentioning here. One of them is actually mentioned in this section, and one of them is mentioned in the Mythic Monsters section, but honestly I feel like it should have been in this section, because I feel like it would have stood out a little more if they did. But essentially, when designing mythic encounters, the two rules of thumb that Paizo gives you are, first, try not to use any creatures that are higher than party level +2, even when you're designing boss fights. If this sounds like typical Pathfinder 2e encounter building, it should. If the level of the monster exceeds the level of the party by too much, you run the risk of throwing off the math in some pretty painful ways, even though you're dealing with mythic characters. So typically what you want to do, even in dealing with mythic monsters, is you want to try to keep those monsters within 2 levels of your party. However, you may be asking, if I am mostly limiting myself to monsters that are within 2 levels of the party, how am I supposed to get those appropriately mythic or narratively impactful encounters? Well, the big piece of advice that Paizo gives again and again throughout this book is hazards. Go ahead and use those mythic monsters that are within 2 levels of your party, but then add a bunch of fun environmental hazards to your encounters to help bump up the overall challenge of what your party is having to deal with. This will give your characters the kind of difficulty that they're expecting for a mythic encounter, and will also serve as a fun narrative backdrop to whatever the scenario happens to be. So, rather than dropping a monster that is party level +5, and hoping that it doesn't crit instant kill your entire team, what you can do is drop a mythic monster party level +2 on top of a active volcano in the middle of a lightning storm, and suddenly you have a number of hazards that your party has to navigate while simultaneously trying to take this villain down. Also, don't overlook things like having a whole bunch of minions and bodyguards that your PCs might have to battle their way through. Those are some other ways to add dramatic stakes without necessarily unbalancing the math of the game. But those are some of the guidelines you want to keep in mind when you are designing mythic encounters. Now, the next section worth reading, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but I do want to highlight this for you. It's pages 86 to 101 of the book War of Immortals, where it talks about the Mythic Gazetteer. Essentially, this is a quick description of how mythic power is influencing the world of Golarion, and a number of different locations around Golarion where mythic stories are playing out. Now, obviously, if your campaign is not set on Golarion, then these specific locations and events are not necessarily happening in your world, but you can still read through this section and get a lot of ideas for what kinds of stories really fit the mythic narrative, the kinds of themes that this book is hoping to highlight. To give you an example, one of the mythic events playing out inside of Golarion is happening in the nation of Rahadum, which fans of the Golarion setting would know is a famously militant atheist nation that actively seeks to eliminate all divine influence inside of their nation. Rahadum and the laws of Rahadum actively persecute divine characters, and currently, inside the Golarion campaign setting, there is an event known as the God's Reign, where as Gorum died, his blood has fallen down on the world of Golarion, and people all over the world are getting divine power. Naturally, this means inside of the nation of Rahadum, things are really messed up. There's a section of the Mythic Gazetteer that talks about the Reign-Blessed in Rahadum, people who have received divine power from the God's Reign, and the reactions that are happening inside the nation. Some of the leaders in Rahadum look at the Reign-Blessed and say that they are merely victims of divine circumstance. They are people who have had these events forced upon them of no choice of their own. But many inside Rahadum see the Reign-Blessed as an affront to their society, and different factions are seeking a number of different solutions to the problem of all of those who have been impacted by the God's Reign. The obvious narrative opportunities of that story are very dramatic in scope, and the reality is, Paizo gave us basically just 15 straight pages of stories on that scale that you as a storyteller can use as inspiration for your game. So again, I'm not going to dive too deep into the Mythic Gazetteer. It's a section you can read through, skim through, get some ideas from, but it is a section I suggest checking out because it's going to give you a lot of great narrative ideas, and as we've said many times in this video, narrative is the core of the Mythic game. Now let's move on to the real treat for storytellers, Mythic Monsters. So the Mythic Monsters section of War of Immortals can be divided into roughly two important sections. The first section is 2 pages long. It's pages 168 and 169, which talks about the rules for applying the Mythic template to monsters inside of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and then also gives a little bit of pointers about building your own Mythic monsters. Then from page 170 through 215, you have, I believe it's 12 different examples of Mythic monsters that have been statted out for Pathfinder 2e. 4 of them are standard Mythic monsters that have been updated from the base version of the monster, and the other 8 represent specific high-level threats that could be the capstone of an entire campaign. So let's talk first about the Mythic Monster template and how you use that as a storyteller. The Mythic Monster template can be thought of as a large template with sort of 4 sub-options that you get to pick from as a storyteller. Essentially, the Mythic Monster template is a big template that you can apply to any monster in Pathfinder 2nd Edition in order to add some mythic abilities to that monster. The table in the book scales all the way from 1st level creatures all the way up to 23rd level creatures, although you can also read some notes for things like level 25 creatures as well, so there is a little bit of guidance if you need to step outside of the strict bounds of that table. But the first part of the Mythic Monster template is just this big template that you can apply to any monster in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and it's going to give the monster affected special abilities at 1st, 4th, 7th, 10th, 13th, 17th, 20th, and 23rd levels. So essentially what you do is you pull out the normal version of the monster and you look at whatever level that monster is, and then you just apply the appropriate mythic abilities up to whatever the level of the monster happens to be. So, for example, if you have a first level monster and you want to make it mythic, you would look at the mythic table, and at first level, you either get to add a mythic resilience, which improves the saving throw, or a mythic resistance to that monster. If you're dealing with a fourth level creature, they get to select a mythic power, which can either be a mythic skill for that creature, or they can get access to the special Remove a Condition action, which allows them to recover from a negative condition by spending a single action to do so. If you have a 7th level monster, again you have the choice between Mythic Resilience or Mythic Resistance, allowing you to either pick another saving throw, or possibly improve the amount of resistance that a monster has. With 10th level monsters, you gain a mythic power called Recharge, where the monster can spend a mythic point to recharge a limited use ability, such as maybe a spell that it can only use so many times per day. Level 13 monsters get another choice between Mythic Resilience or Mythic Resistance. And level 17 monsters get access to an ability called Undying Myth, where if they would die while they still have mythic points, they can spend all of their remaining mythic points and remain standing and auto-heal back up to 50% of their normal health. With level 20 monsters, the Mythic template gives them the option of spending a mythic point to re-roll any d20, or access to an ability called Mythic Defenses, which allows them to force someone that lands a critical hit on them to re-roll their roll and take the new roll instead. And then with level 23 monsters, you have access to Mythic Immunities, which grants the monster immunity to strikes or spells from non-mythic creatures. So that's kind of a layout of what the Mythic template gives you, and essentially what you do is you just pull your monster in and apply all of the abilities up to the level of your monster. So if you're dealing with, say, a level 8 monster, you would look at the Mythic template and it would get the level 1 abilities, the level 4 abilities, and the level 7 abilities, all of the things up to the current level of the monster, and you would apply those benefits to the monster in order to make it mythic. Now, the cool thing about all of this is, this works with any monster in Pathfinder 2e, whether you're dealing with the normal stat block of a published monster that you found in a book somewhere, or if you are building your own custom monster for Pathfinder 2e. If you go over to the GM core, pull out the Building Monsters section of that book, and build a level 8 monster using those rules, once you have your level 8 monster from the GM core, you can then slap the Mythic template onto that monster, and congratulations, you now have a level 8 Mythic custom monster for your game. It works the same way for pre-published and custom monsters. However, there is an additional step beyond just the base Mythic monster template, because there are 4 sub-options that you get to pick from when you are applying the Mythic monster template. Those sub-options are the Mythic Ambusher, the Mythic Brute, the Mythic Caster, and the Mythic Striker. Each of these options is going to modify that main template in some fashion. Now, all 4 of these options, one of the things they're going to do is give your monster a mythic skill of some kind. So, for example, the Mythic Ambusher is going to have Mythic Stealth. What does that translate to? Well, that means that the monster is going to use the Extreme Stealth modifier for its level, because as a Mythic Ambusher, it's really good at sneaking up on you. Mythic Brutes have Extreme Athletics. Mythic Casters have a different extreme skill depending on which spell tradition they use, and then Mythic Strikers will have Extreme Acrobatics, but each of these options is going to give some extreme skill to your monster, and then it's going to have some effect on the different choices that I mentioned. So, to use the Mythic Ambusher as an example again, at first level, a Mythic Ambusher must take the Mythic Resilience option for reflex saves, and cannot choose Mythic Resilience for other saves until higher levels. Meanwhile, the Mythic Caster option is actually going to give the Mythic Recharge ability to the monster regardless of what level the monster is. Mythic Casters do not have to be creature level 10 before they gain the Recharge ability, they have it automatically. Every one of these sub-options is going to have 4 or 5 unique rules about how it modifies the Mythic table, but they are all pretty easy to apply. The Mythic Ambusher is your stealth creature, The Mythic Brute is your big, hulking, physically dangerous creature. The Mythic Caster is your magical threat. And then the Mythic Striker is the fast-moving target that likes to dash in, hit hard, and dash out. For each of these sub-options under the Mythic Creature template, they're going to have a section that gives you some pointers if you are building a custom monster. For example, with the Mythic Ambusher, it has a section called Lair Preparation that talks about how to incorporate hazard design into an encounter when you are building a Mythic Ambusher style creature. There's hazards again. Like I said, Paizo spends a lot of time talking about hazards in this book. Every variation of the Mythic Monster template is going to have some guidance on what to do if you're custom building a monster, but again, whether you're taking a pre-published monster or a custom monster, it's going to tell you exactly how to modify those creatures to make them in line with Mythic Rules. And now that I've talked about using the Mythic Monster template and the 4 sub-templates under that, I want to stress something very important. These templates are very easy to apply, and beyond a few specific things, will not modify the actual stat block of the monster in any way. Typically, when you see a Mythic stat block, you're going to see maybe a few skills that are a bit higher, maybe some modified action, or some things that the creature can spend Mythic points on. But things like hit points, AC, attack rolls, all of those are going to stay the same. If it's creature level 8 when you start the process, it's going to be Mythic creature level 8 at the end, and most of the numbers are actually going to be exactly the same as the original stat block. In fact, I'm going to cut over to my desktop and show you an example of a Mythic Ambusher right now so you can see what the stat block looks like, and I'll actually point out some of the things that changed on the Mythic stat block so you can get an idea of what applied Mythic rules look like on a monster. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to take a look at a Mythic version of a monster and then compare it to the regular version of the monster so that you can see what is different on a Mythic monster stat block. And allow me to go ahead and say there's honestly not much difference. By the way, I should also let you know that the original recording of this segment of the video, that file got corrupted and was unusable, and unfortunately the script that I was using when I originally recorded this is gone, so I'm going entirely off memory, so I apologize if there are gaps in this particular section. But what I want to do is I want to take a look at the Mythic Gogiteth and compare it to the regular Gogiteth, so that you can see the difference between the Mythic and non-Mythic stat block. So, here we have the Mythic Gogiteth. This can be found on page 170 of War of Immortals. And here we have the Standard Gogiteth, which can be found on page 177 of the Monster Core. You will notice that these are both creature level 12. This is the standard version, and this is the Mythic version. And if you look at several of the statistics in these stat blocks, you will see that they are very much the same. Here we have Perception plus 21 with Dark Vision, AC of 31, 250 hit points, Poison Resistance 10. Their melee attack is a Jaw Strike, plus 26 to attack, damage is 3d10 plus 12 piercing, and the improved grab ability. Those are the Mythic stats, and if you go over to the standard version in the Monster Core, you have Perception plus 21 with Dark Vision, AC of 31, 250 hit points, Poison Resistance 10, and if you jump down to the Melee Jaw Strike, plus 26 to attack, 3d10 plus 12 piercing damage, and the improved grab ability. And obviously I'm just discussing bits and pieces of the stat block here, but that should help display the idea that when it comes to a non-Mythic and Mythic stat block, the vast majority of information is going to be the same. Looking at the Mythic Gogiteth, there are just a few places where the Mythic aspect of this monster comes into play. We see right here the Mythic Resilience ability, which was noted in the Mythic Monster Design section. We see a reference to Hazard Immunity. This also comes from the Mythic section. And down here we see a reference to Mythic Power and a few different ways that the Mythic Gogiteth can use that Mythic Power. So the takeaway here is pretty simple. When you are dealing with a Mythic version of the monster, you are mostly just adding a few Mythic-specific abilities on top of the already existing stat block, and you don't have to rebuild the entire monster. So if you have a regular monster in the monster core, you can quickly adapt that to mythic material by adding the appropriate mythic abilities. And if you're using the monster building rules from the GM core, you would build a monster normally, and then to make it mythic, again, you would just add the appropriate mythic abilities in order to finish that building process. So I hope this quick comparison helps you to see that building and adapting mythic monsters is ultimately not much more complex than building or using standard monsters inside of Pathfinder 2e. Alright, back to the regular video. So I'm not gonna lie, I know that Nonat is terrified of the Gogiteth, and I'm really hoping he watches this video and doesn't realize that the Mythic Gogiteth is coming, because I think his reaction would be priceless. But now that you've seen the Mythic Gogiteth, I hope you see that applying the Mythic template to monsters is relatively straightforward. There's not a lot of extra work for you as a storyteller. Now, there are some larger scale mythic monsters that are worth considering, and there are several examples in War of Immortals, but many of those monsters are presented as the sort of creatures that might be the capstone encounter to an entire campaign. For example, I'm going to try to throw a link to a Rules Lawyer video up here, because he did a discussion of the new mythic kaiju that's presented in War of Immortals. And the section on that creature has several pages that talks about how to use that creature in low-level, mid-level, and high-level campaigns. It actually gives an idea of the full narrative arc that you might have to a campaign that features that particular kaiju. I'm not going to go over all of the specific examples from War of Immortals, because honestly this video is already super long, but if you're looking for some excellent examples of how to build an entire campaign around a truly mythic monster, definitely check some of those examples out, because Paizo has given you a lot of material to work with. Still, before we leave the subject of mythic monsters, there is one thing that I'd like to point out that shows up on every example of a mythic monster, and it is something that as a storyteller you want to think about, which is the idea of a mythic weakness. Now, with the mythic monster templates that we discussed earlier, they give you some examples of weaknesses that the creatures might have, and you can definitely use those, or you could build your own when you're creating your mythic monsters. But in keeping with the idea of the narrative weight of mythic stories, just like mythic creatures have incredible powers, they should also have noticeable flaws, and those flaws, those weaknesses, are just as important of a design decision. You as a storyteller want to think of both why a mythic creature is frightening, but also what might hinder that creature, hamper that creature, or serve as the critical flaw for that creature if someone is trying to take it down. When you're developing your mythic monsters, don't just look at the crazy cool powers that they can employ, but also think about what weaknesses that creature might have to deal with. But with all of that, we have covered what I think is the most significant material that storytellers need to be familiar with if you want to use the Mythic Rules from War of Immortals. Again, the four major sections that I think you should review as a storyteller are the What is Mythic section, the Designing Mythic Encounters section, the Mythic Gazetteer, and the Mythic Monsters section. Those four sections taken together really give you an understanding of what you need to be thinking about on the storyteller side of the screen to make the best use of Mythic Rules. I do hope that this video has given you some context for how to interpret Mythic Rules at your own gaming table. But the time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about storytelling in Pathfinder 2e with Mythic Rules? Is there any important advice that I left out of this video? And if you have some experience telling mythic stories, whether they are great successes or some hard lessons learned, please jump down to the comments section and share those thoughts, because all of us grow when we take time to learn from one another. Of course, don't forget to do all the other stuff that helps support the channel. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon. All of those links will be in the video description down below. But, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.